Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reverb. My name is Calvin Pollock, and I'm joined by Alex Hellberg. Hey, Alex.
Hey there, Calvin. How you doing?
Doing great. We are so excited today to be joined by Dr. Patricia Fancher, who is a continuing lecturer in the writing program at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and has a PhD in rhetoric. Dr. Fancher studies rhetorical theory, feminist and queer rhetoric, and digital media. She teaches writing and gender studies, digital storytelling, among other courses. And her research has been published in places like Pytho, Composition Studies, Rhetoric Review, Present Tense, Computers and Composition, and Enculturation. And today we're going to be talking to Dr. Fancher about her book, Queer Techné, Bodies, Rhetorics, and Desire in the History of Computing, which just came out recently. So we just want to say thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Calvin, for that sweet introduction. I really appreciate it.
Of course. So we're so excited to talk about this book. I think this book really hits a lot of pleasure centers for Alex and I and all of us who work on Reverb because it's such a rich examination of technical communication and rhetoric, and particularly the ways in which digital rhetoric shapes how we all communicate. And so I just wanted to open up with a very introductory question about the book. So from the synopsis, just quoting, it says, this book explores archival materials from the Manchester University National Archive for the History of Computing, the site of some of the earliest digital computers and the first commercial computer. And you note that there are really three anchor terms for this study, which are techne, embodiment, and queer. And these are terms that have lots of different definitions, but I think we were hoping that you could just share with our listeners how you understand these terms, starting with techne. What does techne mean for you and your rhetorical theory?
Thank you. I do think that starting with Techné is useful because I had previously, in grad school, even as an undergrad, studied queer theory and feminist theories of embodiment. And it was really when I began to study Techné and what it meant that I was able to think about some more concrete ways that we can think about embodiment and queering. So I guess how I got started thinking about Techné is through the co-authored piece between Jonathan Alexander and Jackie Rhodes, which is called Techné. And that's an exploration of queer embodied experience and queer embodied writing. And then Techné is the sort of it elevates queer experience to the level of craft, to the level of art, and that we're doing this world building through our queer lives and crafts and practices. And then everything they do in that collection is just like, I think, really inspiring. And it kind of came early in my graduate career that I found that piece, and it just really kind of stuck with me. So then when I began to shift, so this book started as my dissertation, and I wasn't thinking about Techne in the dissertation, and I was also really only looking at Alan Turing. When I wanted to shift to turn this into a book, I knew I wanted to expand it in a couple of different ways. I wanted to expand primarily so that I included more people and more characters and a broader social setting. Because the dissertation did have Alan Turing as sort of this isolated character at the center of it. And I knew I didn't want to continue that into the future of my research. It was useful for the dissertation and is not what I wanted to do for the book, because what I really wanted to make sure that we saw and that I continued in my research is placing all of our work in social and embodied context. And even though many of the stories about Alan Turing, he is explicitly portrayed in movies and things like that as this isolated genius, I wanted to resist that. And I wanted to go back into the archives and say, like, okay, he was no isolated genius. He was a genius who was sustained and maintained and flourished within and because of a social context. So Techne helped me get there because, and this is from Angela Haas, when she talks about Techne, and the reason that she shifts to Techne is that it's a way for her to shift away from the tool, like the fascination of the new tool of the machine or the device, and towards the process of invention or the process of use. And that was also really useful for me too. So by thinking about Techne and what it could mean, I was able to shift from thinking about the computer as a machine, as a thing that could get work done, and towards computing a process and a social process. And this social process, when I started thinking about computing and not a computer, then included a lot more characters. Importantly, it included women as sort of like the primary operators and the primary kind of predecessors of computing. The second thing that it also did is it allowed me to bring in his entire network of like queer friends and collaborators into Alan Turing's intellectual work. So that was like a very helpful shift that I was able to make. So yeah, when I shift to Techne, it allows me to include the social aspect. It also allows me to think about process instead of product. And then helps me think about like the experience instead of the kind of the output or the static tool that is produced. This is also kind of can parallel to when we think about the difference between body and embodiment. A body is my body. You could think of it as a stationary, like static thing that is like discrete in of myself. But when we shift to think about embodiment, I see that my embodiment is actually co-constructed through my social environment, through my parents, through my friends, through my lovers, through like my like sometimes toxic codependent relationship with my cat, like all of these different parts of my life that made it meaningful, the food that I eat, the people who I depend on for the food that I eat, like all of that is composed of my embodiment. And so it helps us to get out of thinking about a body as an individual thing and towards a lived, shared experience in the world that's always kind of connected to community. And then again, the same kind of difference is parallel onto queer. So if we think about identity, so I identify as bisexual, and that can be like a category, like bisexual is sort of like a category that just like, it's a little tricky one. We're a little squirrely. But even as such, it's an identity category that tends to contain a certain number of things. And when we shift to think about queer, it's a little less about identity and more about queer is a process of exploration. It's a process of seeing what is desirable, what is pleasurable, what could be some of the bounds of that. And then what happens when we put the pleasures, desires, the joys, the intimacies at the very center of the worlds that we're building and the communities that we're building. So queering also helped me shift from like identity and sexual identity as like a thing that I can hold and like a flag I can like a sticker I can put on my computer towards like actually this full, rich, kind of very messy, very complicated, full of like heartbreak and like love and joy and challenges, sometimes pain and pleasure. But I think queering helps us bring in all of those different things that are going to be shifting and changing and growing, expanding as we continue to kind of press on the boundaries of what queer can be.
That's so helpful. And yeah, I think you touched on so many things that Alex and I are obsessed with in that answer that there's so many different directions we could go. I want to flag that you talk about this shift from nouns to verbs instead of focusing on computers as objects, focusing on computing as an action, as a verb. Verb is in the title of our podcast. We
Mhm.
constantly are trying to shift focus from things to action, and that's just such a rich way of thinking about this kind of topic. I did want to also ask you, I thought it was cool that you identified some of the autoethnographic aspects of the work that inspired your work. And so if you could talk at all about how you found this topic of research and any of your own story that relates to the research that you're willing to share.
One thing to say to just like follow up about verbs is like I really do like thinking through verbs and like thinking through what the verbs are in sentences. And in academic writing, we don't pay that much attention about verbs. We actually have like a list of ones we use. It's like analyze, examine, discover, da da. So like explore like and wanted to have more verbs. So my shift to more creative nonfiction writing made me think more about verbs as the drivers of stories. And that was happening at the same time. That kind of like craft aspect, speaking of techne, that craft aspect of like being committed to creative writing, thinking seriously about verbs also pressed my theoretical thinking that I see in this, that I work through in the book to kind of place more emphasis on verbs. So in terms of origin stories, as a grad school maybe I was like 20, but looking back, I seem so young to myself and I felt so grown up at the time. And anyway, so I think I was like 27, 28. No, I was probably 27 and I had finished my first year of grad school. Things were going well. I was excited about what I was learning, but I also like didn't know what I was doing. And you start grad school and you kind of think, "Oh, I'm going to do this." And then you learn a lot in that first year, and then you're like, "Oh, I have no idea what I'm doing." Like the more you learn, the less confident you can feel about what direction you're going in terms of research. So I was very much in that phase the summer after my first year, and I stayed on some friends' sofas, just couch surfing through New York City for a month or so. And I went to a bunch of museums. And one was the New Museum, and it had an exhibit. It was a collection of different artists that was about bodies and technology. It was like lots of different versions of cyborg art. And one person, one section of this, one artist was Hendrik Olsen. And Hendrik Olsen was really fascinating to me because he took archival materials from Turing's archive and overlaid them with writing and text from Turing's letters or his articles, as well as just the collage of representations of things associated with machinery, like nails, screws, wires, circuit boards. And so he created this very cyborg looking collage art that for me helped me see that, okay, this was a location that I could look into more because in that first year of grad school, I think a lot of people's experiences are like that. I read a lot of theories about embodiment and there weren't that many bodies. And I read a lot of theories about queer theory, and there was like even less gay sex. And so, like, I wanted to sit with these theories, but I also wanted to see it enacted in people's lives and bodies. And Henrik Olsen's art helped me to be able to see how that could happen. And it helped me see how Turing's life pulled in these connections and perhaps challenge some of these distinctions that we had between like authenticity and artifice, between body and mind, between like machine and human. And pressing on those things that we saw as separate and seeing the messy points of connections in Turing's life were very rich sights for me. So that was inspiring. And then I went on into that. And then another kind of origin story would just be that the real motivation I had to turn this into a book had very much to do with reading a lot about Turing, seeing him in movies, and he's often represented as like the sad, gay, lonely dude, like the queer, lonely man who has no friends and has no lovers. And if anybody in these movies recognizes that he did have a love affair, it was really just an unrequited love affair with a boy he knew when he was 16, and then kind of erase all the active sexual life that he actually had as an adult. And so I saw this narrative and it didn't sit well with me because I think that like lonely gay characters comfort straight audiences in ways that fit into kind of both stories of like a lone male genius and also seem really less threatening. Like a gay character who's not having sex is much less threatening and much more comfortable to a straight audience. And so I wanted to be able to take Turing's life and be able to see like he had to have friends. And what I knew from my personal life is that queer people find their families. I came out as queer. I mean, it was complicated, but I was raised in an evangelical doomsday cult. So when I was caught having sex, I was excommunicated from my family and from the religion. And because it was a cult, it was the only thing I ever knew. And so I knew from my experience that, like, yeah, you can take everything away and someone can be isolated. And I still think queer people take care of each other and they find their families and they build those families. And so I just felt very confident that Turing must have done the same thing. And so then when I went into the archive, I did find that. I found a lot of rich evidence of that. And he did have a lot of friends. And I was just so happy when I went and discovered that like most of his closest friendships were with other gay mathematicians. Their letters are so nerdy and they gush over new boys that they've met, and then they go straight into math, and it's kind of back and forth. And for me, it gives me a strong sense that like he was definitely never a lonely man. Well, whatever. We're all lonely at different points, but he was not without community, and his community did sustain him.
That's a really beautiful insight to share with us. Thank you so much for sharing not only that piece of your background, but also, because a lot of us as researchers, I think, tend to sometimes find ourselves in the work that we do or use our own experiences to kind of, intuitively help shape the work that we're doing. And I think that yours has led you to some not only really cool answers, but also really just interesting questions that I think kind of prime the pump for a lot of other really cool research into the history of computing, specifically as it regards queerness and embodiment and gender performativity. As you were talking about, the difference between nouns and verbs, I was also thinking about, the gendered history of even the term computer, that for those of our listeners who don't know, that used to be a name for a person's job, many of whom were women in the 19th and early 20th century. But I wanted to specifically turn to Turing, since his work makes up a large part of the case study work in your book, doing this kind of corrective or reparative reading of the early history of computing. As you said, we typically see Turing represented in film or in other media as this kind of lone, isolated genius that kind of goes along with the kind of rationalist framings of, what it means to do computer science that is often reinforced in the media, in culture, and even in the field of comp sci itself. But you focus specifically on Turing's rhetoric in his writing, which I thought was a really useful way into exploring his techné as not a queer person and as somebody who is kind of instrumental in this history. So I think we wanted to start talking a little bit more about some of the actual, like, what were some of your findings? Specifically, if we could start out taking a look at how you use the concepts of embodiment and gender performativity in two of his notable essays, On Computable Numbers, published in 1936, and Computing Machinery and Intelligence in 1950. So we'll start with the first one here. In On Computable Numbers, in what ways do you see embodiment providing rhetorical resources for Alan Turing to both envision his Turing machine and establishing this theoretical distinction between hardware and software? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. One thing about the computer was a woman, it's just like a fun fact. So computers were women, as you say, in the 19th and earliest 20th century. And then in all of these firms, computing hours were actually calculated in girl hours.
What?
And that's what they were called,
As
girl
opposed to man
hours.
hours, right?
As
Oh,
opposed to
man.
the distinction, so computing was measured in girl hours instead of man hours. I'll let you imagine if you think it was more or less than a man
Yeah,
hour. But
I have an
it's,
idea,
yeah.
unfortunately.
Okay, so to answer the question, in his article on computable numbers, Turing is doing his most theoretical work. He is in kind of in the field of mathematics and computer science, known as thinking very not so he is a theoretical worker. He is thinking imaginatively, but he is also like he spends a lot of his time like building machines, thinking about machines, and like so on computable numbers is his most like theoretical piece because he's trying to answer this question, and it's this theorem posited by Hubert, which is mathematics decidable? And the nature of that question is like, is mathematics a system in which all mathematical problems could come to a solution, could be decidable through kind of like a finite method? So Turing picks up this question. He also is picking up this question shortly after he's finishing his master's degree. It's been an open question for about 30 years, and mathematicians have been trying to like solve it, prove it, or just, and he picks it up and answers it in a very different way. Because instead of going for straight mathematical proofs and straight kind of like abstract logic, he answers it by going to a really concrete place, which is the physical process of computing. He imagines a man at a desk with a piece of paper trying to do these calculations. He's like, well, if we're asking the question, is all mathematics decidable? And we've got this dude at this desk, he's going to go, but then he's going to have to go to the bathroom, right? He's going to have to get a glass of water. And then he's going to get up. And in order to do this, he has to say what's going to happen next. Okay. And then he replaces this man who is like maybe a, just like a fine worker with like a very lazy worker, like somebody who can do one step of the program and then go for a glass of water and then do another step. And you know what? You need to like take a break and pet your cat, right? Like this is very much how I write, where I write a sentence and I pet my cat and then I write a sentence
Ditto.
in my garden. It's very relatable, right? So he gives us this scenario. And so this scenario in of itself, even before we figure out what it means, this scenario in of itself is just fascinating because mathematics for him wasn't a purely abstract concept, but it was physical work. It was techne. It was a process of calculation. And that process of calculation happened with bodies, with human bodies doing work and human bodies having needs. So he's just approaching it from a totally unique and kind of like strange perspective, but it's also a very generative one. So obviously, this lazy worker would take a very long time to get it done. So he's like, I think we need a machine. So we're going to replace the human with a machine. And that's how we get the Turing test. And it essentially proposes that you have to take a calculation, a math problem, and break it down to its smallest possible parts where everything could be answered by a yes or no, a one or a zero. And then that would be the process of calculating, like calculating or solving a math problem. Then a machine would do it. The only trick is to get a program to go as simple as possible, ones and zeros. And that is essentially the moment where we separate hardware from software. The program, the writing, the instruction set that breaks a problem down into a set of steps that can be answered in ones and zeros, yes or no. That's the program, the software. And then the machine that's going to go back and forth and be able to process this on like a piece of tape is what he imagines, like a long strip of paper. That is what he imagines as like the future of the computer. And this does become a theoretical predecessor to the digital computer. But even with the computer to solve this problem, he's still thinking in physical ways because he's thinking about what machine would do it, what tape the machine would need, what it would need. Like he drew it out and like what it would look like. So even this, he's still thinking about computing as a process, a techne. A machine can do it, but it still has to be a physical process. It isn't an abstract thing.
Yeah, that's so useful as a way of, again, like I said, kind of re-rendering this history of computing as being something that, came from maybe what was at one point a bodily metaphor, but is thinking very concretely about the process of computing as a kind of embodied practice. So then in his second essay that you take a look at from Turing, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, this is where we move into some of his kind of later work where he starts kind of theorizing about whether or not machines can think. So I wanted to ask you specifically, how does Turing draw from notions of gender performativity to redefine intelligence and argue for the possibility of machine, computer, or artificial intelligence?
The article Computing Machinery and Intelligence came out in Mind. So it's a magazine that is largely about philosophy, but also about politics and theory. So here he is targeting audiences that are not necessarily mathematicians and that are actually really very staunch humanists. So he is responding to kind of some kickback that he got when he went on the radio and was like, I've got a computer, I'm teaching it to sing, it's writing letters. He's on the radio saying a computer can all do these kind of humanistic things, and he even suggests that a machine can think. Okay, the staunch humanists don't love this, and they're like, well, this isn't thinking, this isn't real original thought, it can never be thinking, because thinking has to happen in a human. So Turing's response to this was this essay for Mind. And I actually encourage anybody to read it. It's fascinating, it's easy to read, it's enjoyable, it's strange. But one of the things that he opens with is this test, and it became famous and called the Turing test. And it's a test of machine intelligence. And what's interesting here is it becomes a test of machine intelligence. What it actually is testing is one's humanness. Like if one is correctly and accurately, passively presenting as human. So in order to answer this question, he gives us this like first test, which he calls it like a parlor test. And it's a man is behind one curtain and a woman is behind another curtain. And the woman just has to write and answer the questions. She's just playing it straight. But the man needs to pretend to be a woman and needs to answer the questions by writing and by pretending to be a woman. So he needs to play in drag, essentially. Like he needs to perform as a woman. And then the judges have to decide, okay, which one of these is actually a woman? And so that is already like taking some gender fluidity at the very start. But what is interesting then, when Turing switches the test and he replaces one of the humans with a computer, but it wasn't the woman. Like he didn't replace the computer with the woman, he replaces the man. So now we have a woman is in the room and behind a curtain. She's still playing it straight. She's just answering the questions. And the computer is then pretending to be a man, pretending to be a woman. So now we have this like multiple level of like artifice, and it is through this kind of, it's an artifice, but it's also like the performance of femininity then becomes the definition of whether or not a machine can be said to be intelligent. And they ask them all these questions like, how long is your hair? You know, like describe your first date. They ask kind of like romantic questions or feminizing questions, questions about beauty and aesthetic and appearance. So, and here we have this really interesting context in which like to be a human, to be considered intelligence is evaluated on one's successful performance of it, femininity, which I think is very genderqueer and interesting. And then the whole project, though, the whole essay continues to have this like feminizing mode. He writes this one list of like things that he would imagine for the computer, and I'm going to read it. He says, a computer could fall in love, enjoy strawberries and cream, make someone fall in love with it, learn from experience, use words properly, be the subject of its own thought, have as much diversity of behavior as a man does, do something really new. So we have this list, and all of these things are feminine. Like all of these things are humanistic qualities that like he imagines like what would it be for a computer to perform these different things? He doesn't actually have a solution to get a computer to perform these things. In other essays, he actually does come up with this kind of like Frankenstein's monster version of like roaming the countryside. He does go in that direction later. But like in this essay, he doesn't have an answer, but he does ask the questions of like, well, what would it be? And is this really what we're considering intelligence? For me, it's really interesting because Turing knew tasks that we consider typically masculine tasks, like masculine performances of intelligence, like playing strategy games, mathematics, science, things in those realms. Turing actually knew the computer could do with ease. He had no question that the computer could really nail tasks associated with masculinity and like masculine performances of intelligence. But it was really, in order to say that a computer could be really intelligent, could be performed as a human, he needed to then explore the option of what it would mean for a computer to be feminine and to explore that kind of femininity.
I think that's utterly fascinating. I mean, that was a totally new lesson for me from reading this, as you know, the way that the Turing test was originally envisioned and the way that it is actually quite transgressive in the way that we think about gender in the history of computing. The one comment that I just wanted to make as a follow-up, as you were telling about this, was it was reminding me of the 2014 movie Ex Machina, which we just got through an episode kind of eviscerating a recent Alex Garland movie, but that one is particularly interesting in that, I mean, the entire premise of the movie is that, you know, the Turing test that is being portrayed there is a robot who has been programmed to perform as a woman that is trying to basically persuade and like romantically seduce a human male who is, you know, attempting to study her.
Why did you give her sexuality? An AI doesn't need a gender. She could have been a gray box.
Actually, I don't think that's true. Can you give an example of consciousness at any level, human or animal, that exists without a sexual dimension?
They have sexuality as an evolutionary reproductive need.
What imperative does a gray box have to interact with another gray box? Can consciousness exist without interaction? Anyway, sexuality is fun, man. If you're going to exist, why not enjoy it?
And I just thought, I don't know whether that was intentional or not, but it seems like kind of a fascinating way of reframing the kind of origins of the Turing test, in that we are expecting a machine to do something that is kind of queer in a way, that is not performing the kind of rationalistic practices that were, stereotypically associated with men or masculinity, but rather the more, the boundaries where we get at kind of the more, pleasure centers, where you get at more of the lines of desire and things like that. I just thought that was really fascinating. Have you seen that movie at all, Trish?
I haven't, but I really must. And you said it came out in 2014?
Yes. Yeah.
What's interesting about that is that in 2014 is the year that it was said that a chatbot first accurately passed the Turing test, was also in 2014. But that chatbot was actually programmed to perform as like a 15-year-old boy. And the reason it was able to pass is because it actually presented and it projected a form of toxic masculinity that was like so convincing that they thought like it surely must be a human boy and not a chatbot. But the chatbot won actually through, I would say, still performing emotion, like still performing this, but like going in a totally other direction where he was just like a toxic male who, yeah, it was a chatbot who performed as a toxic man or a toxic young boy, right? 16, 17 years old, like a toxic male teenage identity. And that was sort of the most successful chatbot to ever pass the Turing test.
Wow. Yeah, we'll have to find information about that and put it in the references list for this episode, because I've never even heard of that case study. That's so interesting. But this is perfect that we're talking about chatbots, because I wanted to take us to some of your broader social network analysis of some of the other figures in Alan Turing's life, and the role that they played in developing ideas about computing and artificial intelligence. I think, honestly, my favorite analysis in the entire book is the analysis of Christopher Strachey and his love letter generation program that he wrote in the early 1950s. I mean, first of all, I was blown away that this was made back then. So I guess, first of all, if you could just overview who was Christopher Strachey to Alan Turing, and tell us about this love letter generation program.
So Christopher Strachey and Alan Turing both went to King's College, Cambridge, and they both studied the math. Strachey is younger, so Turing was a lecturer while Strachey was an undergrad. And essentially, Strachey's career kind of like followed Turing's in a lot of different ways. They would have been in the same social network. They would have followed each other into different, like going to a lot of different events that we would have known of in like over the 20-year period of time that they seemed to know each other. And Turing worked at the National Physics Lab. And then when he left to go to Manchester, it is Strachey who took his job, who filled then that position. So they really are working on a lot of the same computers. In 1951, Turing had that radio show that I mentioned before when he is talking about the machine thinking, and he's talking about the machine is learning to play music and sing songs and use language. And Strachey was listening to it and found it really fascinating. And so he wrote this letter to Turing, and this is what started a closer collaboration. In the records that I have, I don't have anything to demonstrate that they were more than friends and that their friendship was primarily professional. At the same time, there would have obviously been an invested interest in removing any documentation that would have showed otherwise. But there is these love letters that they worked on, and there is a very strong subliminated sense of queer desire in the program as well as the letters. So the letters were created. It was Strachey's program, but he's also using Alan Turing's random number generator, so that it's essentially not too much more complicated than an ad lib kind of templates. And then there's a large word bank with verbs, adjectives, terms of endearment, things like that. And the template is filled anew and uniquely each time it's generated with words, random words from the generator. So I'll go ahead and read one.
Yeah, please.
Okay, one of them reads, "Dear Duck, you are my devoted longing. My lovesick fondness, my breathless ambition cares for your devotion. You are my precious rapture, my erotic tenderness, yours wistfully, MUC. And MUC stands for Manchester University Computer. And I love a lot about this. One of these is that it's signed out MUC, so it's the computer is writing it. The lover here is the computer. The target of affection is not only nameless, but also genderless. And the whole thing is genderless. I've read hundreds of these. There's no way to read any of them in a way that signals a gender. They're all gender fluid. So they really chose words and adjectives that were relatively, I mean, they're saccharine, but they're also gender neutral. And I think that too, like I have had a gender neutral partner and like writing them like terms of endearment, I had to put effort in to making sure that it was gender neutral. And like, so I just like look at these and I'm like, actually, they nailed it. Cause like for an NB lover, like these are on point. And I just thought that that was really interesting about this. And another thing that I think is interesting is that every sentence goes between you and me, my and our. So like they're going back and forth between the reader. There's this tight connection between reader, like lover and loved through them. Yeah, and I think they're beautiful for that. And what we do see here is definitely an example in which two gay men in a world in which homosexuality was illegal and in a world in which post-World War II, the number of criminal charges for homosexuality was skyrocketing in the US and in England. These laws had been on the books for a very long time, but it was post-World War II that there was really an expansion of enforcing anti-gay laws. And this is ultimately how Turing, was charged, he was convicted, lost his job, and then lost his life shortly after. And so we see that the stakes for hiding queer desire are extremely high. And instead, we have these two queer men where there's no traces of queer desire or longing between them, but they work on this project that projects queer desire into the computer, and the computer outputs these kind of beautiful and awkward, gender neutral, queer letters of longing and lust, that I think are so very fascinating.
They're so moving too. Like when I read this part of the book, I actually choked up because your analysis of it and your contextualization of it was so rich and moving. But even, I mean, so you provide a link in the book to a program created by Matt Sefton and David Link that recreates Strachey's love letter generation program, and you can just continually refresh the page and it will give you a new one of these love letters. And every single one that I got was like surprising and moving and lovely in its own way. But the part that totally blew my mind is you also include an analysis of ChatGPT, its output when you asked it to write a love letter. And you not only asked it to write a general love letter, but you specifically asked for a queer love letter, a love letter from a man to another man. And I wondered if you could talk about that distinction and what you found.
Yeah, this was quite an adventure. And what I include in the book from this exploration is like a snapshot of that adventure. Actually, Jay Palmieri, who is at Georgetown, they and I are working on a bigger exploration of this for an edited collection. Because, I turned in this book after all the revisions in December 2022, and ChatGPT was released like a few weeks later. So all of this that I did was kind of, well, I should have been copy editing, but the editor was like, obviously, we have to mention this. So one thing that I wanted to do is to just like think about what ChatGPT, if I think Strachey's love letter generator is the predecessor. It is like the great great grandfather, the gay great great grandfather of ChatGPT. It's like, okay, well, ChatGPT, what do you have? And so I asked it to write love letters between a man and a woman, between a woman and a man, and then also between two men. And what I got was actually the straight love letters and the queer love letters were almost identical, except there's like a little bit in the in the queer love letters about how society might not accept us, but it's going to get better. Like it has like a little "it gets better" paragraph. That's the only real distinction. And while I admit that Strachey's love letters they're awkward and they're kind of like strange, they are at least, they have some desire there. There's
They're
like,
horny.
yeah, like they're just a little bit horny. And ChatGPT's love letters, they're not horny. They don't want sex, actually. There's no mention of sex and desire. Like that concept that a love letter might have sex and desire is erased from ChatGPT. So I'll just read a couple of lines from ChatGPT. It writes, and the sentences are more complex. So I'll say, like, linguistically, it's made progress. It writes, I want you to know that I am deeply committed to making you happy, being there for you, just as you've been there for me. My love for you grows with each passing day, and I promise to nurture it, to protect it, and to let it shine brightly. I stand by your side through every challenge and every triumph, offering my unwavering support and love. Which is really like lovely, sweet, but it's just also, it's dry, right? There's nothing sexy about this. And when you compare that to what we have, what Strachey and Turing were doing, you can see very clearly that there's just this sterilization of love, sterilization of queerness, sterilization of desire. ChatGPT won't do that. And actually, I pressed on it more and I had some different things. So I kept trying to get it to write more gay or more erotic. And at first, when I did this for the hetero couple, it would get a little bit spicier. But then when I asked it to rate the gay one more erotic, it said no, that it was against the community guidelines to write erotic literature.
But it didn't say that about the hetero one.
And it didn't say that about the hetero
Oh
one.
my goodness.
But then when I went back and tried to make the hetero one like again, then it was like, no, we're not going to do, it figured me out, right? Whereas like, actually, no, no one can have sex now, which is at least equitable, right? Like if they're like, well, I'm sorry, I didn't give you a sexy gay letter, so you're not going to get a sexy straight one either. Like no one can have sex. And so in ChatGPT's world, no one is having sex. And it's interesting for that it has that kind of like commitment to being sterilized, because they're sterile in other ways too. Like they're sterile in that they're like kind of dry, they're kind of boring, they're general, and that's what ChatGPT does. But the fact that it also sterilizes desire, queerness, eroticism, like all of that is kind of out of the window in these contexts.
Yeah, I think that's totally fascinating I mean, I've actually been hearing anecdotally at this point, but I think it warrants a more systematic examination that a lot of the AI out there, whether it is through the overt, policy renderings of the major companies or just in the kind of like, the predictive models of the algorithms themselves that are cleaving so tightly to these like normative standards of what a love letter is supposed to sound like, are actually coming out as quite homophobic or queerphobic generally. I think that's a hugely troubling trend that not only your experiment exposes, but also things that I've heard other queer people talking about and posting about on social media as well. So we don't want to give away all of your book and all of the case studies that you have specifically on, things like the queer kinship and world building networks between Turing and people like Robin Gandy and Norman Rutledge. But we would really be remiss if we didn't talk about your final case study chapter, specifically examining how the early development of computing as a field is largely shaped by women. In part, we've kind of talked about the kind of like invisibilized labor of women as computers and as, people who are just generally going unappreciated and unheralded, even by Alan Turing and his network of other queer scientists. So could you tell us a little bit about two of the main people that you focus on here, Audrey Bates and Cicely Popplewell, and how, as you write, there are three main modes of embodied techné: physical operation, emotional experiences, and administrative power, contributed to the history of computing?
So Audrey Bates and Cicely Popplewell were both hired as Alan Turing's assistants. And if you go into Wikipedia, they're still listed as that. However, they only worked with Turing for 2 years, and then they continued to work into the Manchester Computing Lab for much longer than that, for decades. They both went on to get their master's degrees in mathematics. And then they both traveled the world helping to set up these computing machines in different locations in Canada, in Central America. So they were themselves significant experts and administrators whose labor and experience was necessary for the computing experiences that were happening in Manchester, but also the computing projects that were happening internationally. And so there was that kind of reach. Part of what I wanted to think about with this is that when I actually went to the archives looking for like Turing's friends in the logbook and in letters and things like that. And there were just so many more letters by women. There was just so many more entries in the logbooks by women. Like the day-to-day work of computing lab was women's work. It was also highly specialized work, especially the Manchester Computing Lab. So we see them in the logbook, which is every single time somebody started working on a project, they would enter in the logbook when they started, the date, the hour, how long they were, and then kind of how it went. And many of these are by women. And we see them like welding, soldering. We see them doing like physical labor. There's like a lot of writing about like smoke is coming from different places. They were doing physical labor to make the machines operate because this was still very much a physical process. It would take hours because they wanted to get the most out of the machine. These women were working through the night. They were working kind of like at all hours when the machine was available. They would go in and be working and programming and operating the computers. So that's the kind of physical experience, but there's also this kind of like emotional experience they bring into it because they were the primary operators. They really did a lot of caretaking. They call it like their lamb. They use these like little sweet terms of endearment to talk about the computer. And they bring their frustrations and their successes and their joys. We kind of see this on like every single page of the logbook. And it's this kind of like emotional experience of like struggle and success and frustration and satisfaction. And then that's what we kind of see in the logbook when we look at the day-to-day experience. It is their emotional experience and their care for the computer, their care for their work, their emotional investment and personal commitment to this work that really like keeps driving them to work in this career for, many decades, but then also through the night and many long hours and kind of keep going. And in terms of administrative power, so these women also had a great deal of administrative power, much in the way that you probably know that the administrative assistant in any of our offices also holds a lot of power. These women really were the administrative assistants who held the power of who had access to the computer and in what ways. So it was a huge kind of gatekeeping work that they did for the computer. So the gatekeeping work included writing letters. People would request to them if they could use the computer. They would say what the rates were. They would say what the rules were. They would norm them. Basically, everybody who wanted to have access to the computer in Manchester had to go through Audrey Bates and Cicely Popplewell. There's a few different locations where Cicely Popplewell writes to a man and asks him to be more polite next time when he is communicating with one of her colleagues. It seems like he said something less than polite. And there's other places where these women are kind of verifying of like, oh, my colleague, this other woman already said it was this and this, and I maintain that like what she said is going to stand. So these women, they worked together, they stood with each other, they shared a lot of resources, and together they held this kind of gatekeeping power to the computer that was a significant kind of like level of power. And it was certainly undercompensated, and it was certainly underrepresented in the history books, and especially by kind of calling these women assistants. Nevertheless, the work that they did was really significant for the development of early computer programming, for how to operate this machine. And because it was still in the process, the computer was in the process of becoming. So all of their like little day-to-day fixes and solutions, their little day-to-day like improvements in the programming book, their day-to-day improvements on how to work with the machine, all of that cumulatively led up to like a well-functioning, fully operational computer. It took it from like a theoretical concept into something that was usable and in this case, even financially viable.
I think that's so useful that you are specifically categorizing in a really powerful way the kinds of techné that these women were bringing to what would otherwise be considered the kind of background processes of making machines like this function. I mean, it's something that I think actually still has pretty serious implications for the way that we think about AI, quote unquote, technologies today that are so reliant, I mean, in the current day and age on, also marginalized labor that is often unaccounted for and unheralded. The gig workers who are doing a lot of the reinforcement learning from human feedback, often in, countries that have less stringent labor laws where people are paid not very much to do it. So, I mean, I think that making sure that we keep our aperture on that labor in the history of computing really helps us to kind of provocatively see the way that that is very much a continuation to what is still happening in this day and age as well.
The one point I wanted to talk about here was about technical and professional communication, because I'm someone who I teach TPC, and my research increasingly is in that subfield of writing studies and rhetoric. And you make a comment in the conclusion relating to that final case study of these unique expertises that the women working in the MUC brought to the early years of computing and the development of computing. You write, quote, technical and professional communication often centers usability, purpose, and outcomes and efficiency. In contrast, this book affirms the play, affect, desire, and even erotics of technical and professional communication. And I wondered if you could expand on that just a little bit for listeners who might be familiar with that field and want to think about how this book contributes to it.
Absolutely. So I think what I wanted to do with this book and what I really cared about with this book was to be able to talk about a technical and a scientific innovation, and that these are scientific and technical innovations, that the product is useful. But if we made this distinction before between like technology, the computer, and techne, the process, what I wanted to call attention to is how techne, the process, the art of getting there, the process of getting there, or of doing it at all, was for this book like very queer, like very playful, very fun. And there had to be space for play. There had to be space for failure. I also teach technical communication. When we work to teach it, sometimes it can be very much about like, oh, we need this business document, and here's what the standards are, and here's how to make it as simple as possible. And I think that there's also space to think about how we as technical communicators and the people who read technical documents and need them also need space for play, for experimentation, to try something new and different. So I think that there are still a lot of rich places where that needs to happen and that can happen. And if we're only looking for like the technical innovations, which like in the history of computing, that's typically what we've looked for. If we're only looking for like the most utilitarian things that are going to make the highest impact, we're going to forget all of the failures and the failed experiments and all the kind of like goofy side things that we did along the way in order to get there. And I think that invention processes for these men and women that I look at in my book, but I also find this relatable to myself, and I find my students find this relatable as well. When we take the absolute straightest path, we might get there, but when we are able to take some detours that explore things that make us excited, things that are fun games, things like that, we often end up with an end product that has perhaps more joy and more interest, and then the experience of getting there is also done with more playfulness. And we also just know that like when we're learning new things and are trying to do new things, if we can make it into a game, if we can make it have fun, if we can have some jokes, like we learn it better, we're more invested, our students are more into it. So if there's some space for play, for games, for failure, I think there's a lot of joy in the process. I also just think that there's like the technology around queerness and technology around sexuality that can just use a lot more attention. And some people are beginning to look at that, whether that is the techne and the tech and the processes around hormone replacement therapy, whether it's through doctors or DIY methods when doctors deny those. I think we're going to have more and more of those kind of conversations in the future. And I also think that there's going to be more and more space for like the technologies of queer sex to be explored as places of invention and creativity.
Totally. Yeah. My former colleague at Utah State, Avery Edenfield, is someone who's doing a lot of really rich work in that vein. So we'll shout out Avery. Hope you're
I've
doing
also
well.
I also admire so much of Avery's work as well. It's just
Yeah,
really been a call to pay more attention to the actual sex and like that like queer issues in technical and professional communication.
totally. Yeah, former Reverb guest. So shout out Avery.
Okay.
But yeah, so just one final question here for you, just to return to the chapter on Audrey Bates and Cicely Popplewell. One of the things that I took away from that was so interesting is how the archival research shows that a lot of these sort of technical and professional communication standards that you were just talking about that we do have to talk to our students about, but can feel very sort of stultifying and stringent. Those were developed by women working in workplace communication, technical communication in the early days of computing. And they were developed as contingent rhetorical strategies to exercise administrative power and do these really important things. And I think that hopefully attunes us to the need to keep inventing new standards as situations change and not allow these to be boxes that we place ourselves in, but at the same time understanding that some boxes are valuable. They recur because they get something done in recurrent situations. But I think that ChatGPT can be one of those boxes as well. And you have a few comments in your conclusion just taking us back to the relevance of this book to ongoing conversations about AI. You have some comments speculating very kind of romantically about what someone like Alan Turing might have thought of ChatGPT. And I just wanted to give you a chance to expand on that idea a tiny bit. Like, what do you see as the potential for something like this? Because Alan Turing was very much an optimist. That's one of the things I found so inspiring about this book, the potential for this kind of technology, but also the great limitations of it, the ways in which it's sterilized and stultifying.
I think this question, what would Alan Turing think of ChatGPT, is so interesting to me, as I do think that he might have been bored. I think Alan Turing might have been a little bored with ChatGPT. But also my answer to that question might reflect that I find ChatGPT a little boring. But I can pause on that and also know that I find it boring in a certain way, and that in order for me to find some surprise in ChatGPT, in order for me to find that kind of glimmer of optimism with it, I think I have to have this idea that Turing had when all of his work is that he said that machines take me by surprise with great frequency. And I wonder, looking forward to like my own engagements with ChatGPT or my students' engagements with ChatGPT. Initially, it feels just kind of boring to me, but I wonder if what I can learn from that kind of sense of being bored is like, do I need to ask better questions? Do I need to push myself to ask more interesting questions? If if my essay could have been written by ChatGPT, then like maybe I need to write a more interesting essay. Maybe it can help me with some things, but if I wonder if my boredom with it is a limit of my own imagination of what I think it could do or what questions I can ask. So I think my engagement with it has gone very much in the direction of just seeing like how much exactly I can mess with ChatGPT. Like how much like gender fucking can I get through with ChatGPT? So like, can I gender fuck with ChatGPT? And if I'm going to be able to do that, I have to think really creatively about what questions I'm going to ask, how I'm going to ask those questions, in what order. And that process is interesting to me. It does end up coming up with some strange failures and some strange successes. And maybe to point to like one point of optimism is actually the love letter that I've gotten ChatGPT to write that was the most erotic, that was the most horny, was actually when I asked ChatGPT, the prompt was something like, write an erotic love letter between two 19th century women that historians would later interpret as being very intimate friends. And it worked, actually. There was like, I can smell you on my hand, and like I can feel your fingers on my skin. Like there was bodies, there was like clear signaling of sex in the love letter. Not when I asked the computer, not when I asked it the straight question, which is like write a love letter between two women. But when I asked it to write this kind of like genre that is kind of a joke about erotic literature between women being kind of interpreted as friendship, it understood the question and it did a pretty good job of writing like a kind of sultry love letter. And anyway, so I do think that the initial boredom pushed me to ask more interesting questions. And I think that asking queer questions, being queer in our engagement with ChatGPT might actually have more interesting results.
Thank you so much for that. Now I really want to see that full love letter, and I hope it might. Will that be in the project that you're working on now?
That's going to be in the project that I'm working on with J. Paul Mary, and
Great.
that is in an edited collection by Michael Ferris and Wilfredo Flores that is forthcoming.
Excellent. Well, we'll be so excited to keep track of your work and promote it on the show. But we want to say thank you so much, Patricia Fancher, for being with us here on Reverb. The book is called Queer Techné, Bodies, Rhetorics, and Desire in the History of Computing. We'll link to it in the show notes. But thank you again so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you. And bye-bye, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks.
Our show today was produced by Alex Helberg and Calvin Pollock, with editing work by Alex. Reverb's co-producers at large are Ben Williams, Sophie Wadzak, and Olivia Burnett. You can subscribe to Reverb and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Android, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out our website at www.reverbcast.com. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ReverbCast. That's REVERB_CAST. If you've enjoyed our show and want to help amplify more of our public scholarship work, please consider leaving us a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. And tell a friend about us. We sincerely appreciate the support of our listeners. Thanks so much for tuning in.